This is Archaeodeath, an exploration in the archaeology of death and memory, past and present, with Professor Howard Williams.
Archaeodeathlings, it's Archaeology Professor Howard Williams here with my fourth video about Andor Season 2, the Star Wars series that takes us for the second season going on a journey through the origins of the rebellion against the Galactic Empire that sets the scene for the original Star Wars films. And in the three previous videos I have explored the archaeological dimensions to the three principal worlds which are the focus of the tensions between Empire and Resistance, namely Coruscant, Chandrila and Gorman. And when I say archaeology, I mean archaeological inspirations for the pastness reflected in the architecture, the landscapes, the monuments, the material culture, the costumes, as well as themes that link archaeology in our world to the archaeology of the Star Wars universe, such as the value of heritage and protection versus imperialism, colonialism, nationalisms, and the various ways in which the past is manipulated. And I think that the city-wide planet of Coruscant and its consuming centrality for the galaxy, with all its technology and its architecture and the lack of any natural vegetation or animals, is sort of one critique on our world, this ultimate sort of capitalist consumption, but it also evokes deep antiquity and ancient cities like Rome and their being imperial hubs, bringing people and resources from all over, and the antique selling and the antiquities on display are an interesting dimension of that reflect on the trade and our in antiquities, its ethics, the ripping things out of cultural context as part of that consumerist, colonial and imperial world. But then we move over to Chandrila, which we see a world under the oppression of the empire, but very much free and privileged and wealthy, with bankers and palaces, very much like a sort of liberal classical Greek stereotype from the ancient world, as well as showing again a futuristic idyllic world of privilege and luxury for at least a few. And then we go to Gorman, a planet with a pride in its industry and its production of twill that is sold across the galaxy. So they're fully embedded in the imperial economy. They're mercantile, they're traders, they are capitalist, if you like, but they are resisting against increasing imperial oppression. And so the material cultures of Gorman, from their the cafes and bars, hotels, offices, through to their public spaces, sort of evoke this city in resistance against imperial domination, somewhat evoking between the wars Europe, occupied Nazi Europe, such as France, but also evoking more ancient times, historic backdrops of Central Western Europe in the 18th, 19th century. So there's lots of ways in which the past, not necessarily real or accurate past, but evocative senses of pastness, are important to the storytelling of Andor Series 2, that help viewers understand this rich, complex, fictional galaxy, and where an empire is trying to control so many different species, so many different cultures, and so many different worlds. And so this leads us to the fourth part, which is about Yavin 4. And this is very much about the storyline too, that the archaeology represented here helps to set up the story of the Rebel Alliance, various groups coming together to form a rebel base on the moon of Yavin 4. But also there's a lot of sort of nostalgia for Star Wars itself in the representation, because it takes us back to the original filming choice locations of the film A New Hope, in which we see George Lucas's decision to film at the Mayan city of Tikal. And so in Guatemala appears in this landscape. And it's important to just chart what we see. This is about the run up to the Battle of Scarif, and then Yavin itself, the Rogue One and then A New Hope film storylines. And the idea is we need to be seeing the development of that rebel base, and this comes in an unexpected way in episode 2, where we encounter a sort of CGI version of the UNESCO World Heritage Site of Tikal, which is a mid to late first millennium CE sort of proto-urban site or cityscape of the Maya in the classic period, as it's called. 16 square kilometres, 3,000 structures, platforms, residences, ball games, courts, terraces, roads, squares, as well as temples. And it's the temples that originally appeared in the original A New Hope, then in the 2016 film Rogue One, where we get the sort of a few scenes of this Yavin 4 base in the run-up to the rebel raids on Edu, and then the emergency sending of the rebel fleet to Scarif to support Rogue One's attempts to retrieve the data tapes for the Death Star plans. But here we get to see the very origin. So it does seem, from what little I've read about it, that George Lucas's choice was really just to evoke a sense of pastness and mysticism and ancient times, and there was no real sort of clear vision of what these temples or pyramidal structures are supposed to represent. So, and very much they keep it quite obscure in this sequel too, that you never get to see or really understand what these temples are. Now Wikipedia tells me they're Massassi Temples that are supposed to represent a long lost people, and of course we could critique that being imposed on Mayan temples, because the Maya haven't gone, they're not a lost people, but we're talking about romanticized tropes of Western fiction, Orientalism and colonialism, where the mystery of ancient complex civilizations continues to be a trope of pseudo-archaeology. And so here we see that playing into this idea of an ancient lost people that provides a ready cover for a base. So it's like a mountainside of caves. It is bored and created and adapted. The Great Temple on the Great Massassi Temple is utilised as a cover and a structure in an isolated corner of the galaxy, where the rebels can build their strength, logistics, training, and so on. So at one level it's rather incidental. Another level it feeds into those sort of mystical ancient tropes of a relic ruins of old civilizations that give some kind of depth to the galaxy and its cultures, but without being too specific. Now the way this is introduced is that in episode 2, Sagrona Tima, Cassian escapes with a stolen TIE fighter, experimental TIE fighter, but ends up being kidnapped by a bickering group of rebels who are stranded on this unnamed planet, and he manages to escape, and as he flies away you see, the viewer gets to learn that this is Yavin 4, so you learn that this bickering mess of resistance fighters who don't seem to show any promise for ever cohering into a rebel alliance are the sort of unpresuming and indeed quite disappointing and unpromising a basis from which the rebel alliance will immediately come. So you're being shown, I think it's really interesting, because you're being shown like this is the mess of most resistance. This is the default of most resistance organisations, internal infighting leading to conflict. And it could easily just continue that way. The empire could continue for centuries, and all you would have is just bickering groups shooting each other and arguing over small bits of stolen imperial tech and mech. But here you see sort of Andor Cassian's able to escape them and make his own way away from them. And you know, we never learn whether those individuals ever contribute to the final rebel alliance, or they just kill each other or starve or whatever. But the fact that it's on Yavin 4 is a deep piece of irony that but also it sort of foreshadows sort of future past that never happened, that it could have just been a mess, but instead we know that it's going to build to something that is successful. But so I don't know the best word to frame that, but I think it's a really interesting use of archaeology for a fictional world to sort of give you that past sense of an ancient abandoned planet, sure, but also as a visual signifier that this is the planet that's going to become the focus of the Rebel Alliance, and yet look at what could be, what could be just a mess. So I really thought that was a very short but very important visual clue. And then throughout subsequent episodes we see some really striking visuals as spacecraft arrive, and leave from these Massassi temples, and we see that yes, there are elements of the original Mayan architecture still there. I'm not an expert in Mayan architecture, but the tops of the pyramids, the temples that are very much what you see in the original New Hope film, they've retained in crude terms, but they've adapted the main body of the pyramid, made it much taller, much more complicated, showing multiple layers of steps, some of which go all the way to the top, others which stop at halfway point, but also large galleries, which you could imagine therefore already facilitating rapid landing and takeoff of spacecraft. So you get a sense of how it's being adapted or utilised from being an ancient sacred space, holy to a particular lost civilization, into a military infrastructure. So it's something that's very deceptive. Even on close inspection, you cannot quite perceive how it's being used. And I think that was the whole point, that it's hiding in plain sight. That you're not trying to. And I think in some of the broader canon discussions, there's deep mined caves underneath, so you have that. This is the sort of tip of the iceberg of a more complex rebel establishment, and so we can just marvel at the sort of the giganticism of this. They've created a cyclopean scale out of the Mayan ruins to give you that sense of. And each of though we don't see them close up, the other temples seem to be smaller but have different designs, so you get that sense of evolution or development within that ancient culture, which is long lost and never discussed. And the power of this comes from guesswork. We are encouraged to imagine. No one tells us this history, it's just there in the backdrop. And we see it over water, and you get the sense of the scale above the jungle, the dense jungle with tall trees, taller than a deciduous forest in Europe. These are massive trees, and yet look at the scale in which these massive temples rise above. And so you get the sense that this is nothing they're not trying to evoke anything specific about any particular period or time of the human past, but it is evoking that sense of pastness so well. And we see it at night, in rain. We see these temples from different perspectives, and you see here the brightness of the lights of the organisation going on, the bustling activities at the base, and I think this all just builds the narrative. All these visuals are in themselves rather incidental, but together they build their world building, but for a world we never see, an ancient ruin. So these are echoes of a past time and the adaptation of these ruins into a rebel base. So again and again we see them. Here I think it's a really interesting view because they almost look natural, like sort of peaks across a landscape, and you get a sense that even though this is a moon, the scale of the landscape gives you that sense of even those massive monuments are easily lost in a galaxy so large if people don't know where to look. We also get a sense that the broader forest landscape is utilised, that the Massassi temples are not the only elements being utilised, and we get various insights into the huge monumental structures, very much drawing on a range of Eurasian and African and Mesoamerican and other South American architectures to give that sense of antiquity, and the bustling use of these as hangars with lights fitted, but the mixture of light fittings and busy activities, the emergence of that aesthetic we're so familiar with from the 1970s films is alluded to in terms of hats, goggles, gilets. It's all there. The beginnings of that, the orange X-wing uniforms. You get the sense of that building aesthetic of nostalgia and the building towards the Rebel Alliance that we're familiar with, but also behind the scenes, the context for all of this is this temple. And yeah, so really important scenes where you see the vines growing, that sense of antiquity over ancient stonework that's preserved. You see bits of chipped, and you also see, never really brought out, but in a couple of scenes you see this pyramid glyph that serves as some kind of symbol at the entry point with different stone on the lintel, suggesting a more complex design, and it lurks in the backgrounds of other scenes too. We know that this is not simply for spacecraft and military. There's conference rooms. So here's Admiral Radish and Mon Mothma and all the rest of the standard characters, Senator Organa, are trying to be engaged with Andor, and you see it all happening within not only their installed modern infrastructure, but also this backdrop of sacred architecture, which the details of which are never revealed or explained. So I think that's a really powerful, persistent use of the past. So we've now gone through 4. We've looked at Coruscant, Chandrila, Gorman, and then Yavin 4 as a moon, which is so important, where archaeology in this case is the inspiration of Tikal, and the tradition of the films were building towards that rebel base. You're seeing the prequel foreshadowing of pasts that happen, and past also evocations of past that never were, of warnings of what could so easily have happened, the failure of a resistance force and the bickering that could unfold. And in the final video I'm going to discuss the various other planets that only appear in the backdrop and very briefly, but are so important for setting up the story of the resistance to this galactic empire, and seeing the various different cultures and planets with different types of society, I think are really important for that galaxy building, if not world building, that feeds into the way in which archaeology is an active choice by the designers, the story writers, to create this sense of pastness to inform the Star Wars universe narrative. And Andor, we have to remember, is the most serious and effective of all of the Star Wars genres in telling a powerful story that touches on our world. And so just as these are about a fictional galaxy, and it tells us about how the importance of archaeology in our society for telling the stories of who we are, there's also, as I keep repeating, there's an absence of archaeologists, there's an absence of antiquarians even. There's a few characters who act in a detective or adventuring or antiquarian way, but there's no clear sense of any institutions, organisations that support and cultivate and promote cultural memory, education, heritage protection. And that in itself is revealing. It's very much a laissez-faire fascist world or universe or galaxy where no one cares for the past until it's absolutely utilitarian and necessary. And I think that amnesia, the fact no one talks about history, we get closest to it with Ahsoka, and I've discussed that in blog posts, but no one really gets into that story, I think is quite disturbing. And it does induce an anxiety in me as an archaeologist who cares about history, archaeology and heritage, that this universe is living in denial of itself and in a kind of weird bubble of constant lack of engagement, lack of knowledge of its past. And even the Jedi don't really seem to understand the history of the galaxy, let alone any of the other characters in Andor. And that sort of sense of disconnection from the past is also a feature. So while I'm talking about these evocations of the past, it's that almost cultural amnesia that is the common thread of Andor, linking Luthen's antiquities through to the various landscapes of Coruscant, Chandrila, Gorman, with Gorman perhaps being the exception of a culture that seems to be living and connected to its past, but also on Yavin, the rebels don't seem to have any real understanding or knowledge of the ruins in which they're inhabiting. Anyway, I'll leave it there, and I hope that's of interest, and I'll come back and record another video looking at the other planets.
If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing to Howard Williams on YouTube. In addition, consider following the Archaeodeath WordPress blog at howardwilliamsblog.wordpress.com.